Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased that you're all here for this discussion. It's a pleasure for me to chair it here at ODI, an institution now more than half a century old. And may I take this opportunity to applaud the work of ODI and also in particular that of the Humanitarian Policy Group, which has organized this meeting and which has been in the forefront for many years of progressive thinking about humanitarian action in the field. A lot of my career was with the United Nations. I served in Cambodia and the Balkans in the 90s, and latterly I was UN Special Representative in Lebanon between 2008 and 2011, at precisely the sort of point where the terrible conflict in Syria began. In fact, of course, it's worth reminding ourselves we're now at the beginning of the 5th year of this conflict, a war which has seemed to know no boundaries, which has tipped over into neighboring countries, and which has been associated with massive human rights violations, and which the international community, I think, has struggled to deal with in almost every aspect, including the main aspect that we are going to focus on this afternoon, namely the humanitarian aspects of the conflict. Now, I'll present very briefly our, I'm delighted by the panel, by the way. It's a fantastic panel. On my left is Eva Svoboda, who's going to speak very shortly about a report that ODI are launching today, Eva? Very good. And then on my immediate right, we have Urula, who was brought up in Homs and in Damascus, but was actually born in Newcastle and is a Liverpool supporter, but there we are. And then we have Rebecca Thompson, who's Director of Programs for Partnership in the Middle East with Mercy Corps. And finally, on my far left, Dr. Mulham Mantabi, Trustee of Syria Relief and General Secretary of the Syrian British Medical Society. He is an eye surgeon. Rula is a specialist in anesthesia and intensive care. The rest of us are not doctors, or I'm a doctor of something else. Okay, I'm going to turn over the floor now to Eva to talk for about 10 minutes on the main findings of the report, which you and Sarah have written.
Thank you very much. When we started our research, we did not actually set out to look at Syrian diaspora and local groups, but we came to the conclusion very quickly that they played a crucial role in the humanitarian response. So we looked at how they were formed in the early days of the conflict, and in many ways it was Syrians living, for example, in the UK, in the US, Australia, France, and elsewhere, literally kind of getting together sometimes around the kitchen table and saying, you know, what can we do? We need to help Syrians back home. The UN estimates that since the beginning of the conflict, there have been about 600 to 700 of these local and diaspora organizations that were created. Many of them relied on volunteers, holding down full-time jobs here in the UK, for example, while at the same time traveling to Syria during their spare time. We looked also at their activities and their programs, and many of them initially focused on giving medical aid, medical doctors. We have two of them here on the panel, traveling to Syria to help in medical facilities there. But other activities include provision of food or clothes and other material assistance. But also, and equally importantly, it's providing, for example, psychosocial support to children. Children have in these 4 years suffered tremendously. but also support to families, for example, who have no breadwinner. And we all know that child labor has become a problem in relation to the Syria conflict. And so supporting families to avoid that children need to work is another area of work. And lastly, some organizations focus on documenting violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, documenting what kind of weapons are used, the number of casualties, and so forth. Access has been a huge problem in the context of Syria. The Syrian government, but also the number of armed groups, a number of different armed groups are preventing organizations from accessing people in need. And this has hampered the humanitarian response, especially of the international organizations. That gap has almost inadvertently been filled by Syrian diaspora and local organizations. They were able to fill this gap and reach people in need because they've got the local connections, they've got the networks, they know the country, they know, obviously, the language, and so they can reach people in need. But it's by no means easy for them either. Just to give you an example, at one point in 2014, traveling from the Turkish border to Homs, about 300 kilometers, would take 16 days, just because there are a number of checkpoints that you need to negotiate through. And local and Syrian NGOs have a particular advantage there because they know that kind of area and they can negotiate with all these various armed groups. I'd like to focus on three particular challenges that Syrian organizations have faced. There are a number of others, and they are explained in the report, but I'd like to focus on partnerships, funding, and the effect of counterterrorism legislation. First of all, partnerships. Now, that term means a lot of things to different people, and I think one of the problems is that it's not clearly defined. Quite often, the Syrian groups we spoke to felt more like service providers. They felt that they were not on an equal footing with international organizations, that there was a lack of trust, that there was no shared risk, no sharing of risks and responsibilities. In relation to partnerships is also capacity building, yet another of these terms that is not clearly defined, that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So the groups we spoke to at times would say they'd be invited to a workshop, which is great, but it would be half a day, it would be ad hoc, and it wouldn't necessarily respond to the needs that they have. We have to bear in mind many of these groups have grown immensely in 4 years. So from literally the kitchen table to 900 staff members. How do you manage an organization that has grown so quickly? You need organizational capacity. And so some of these capacity building or training workshops do not or did not respond to the needs of Syrian organizations. They would have needed perhaps something on monitoring and evaluations, or, for example, dealing or managing the effects of counter-terror legislation, but I'll come to that a bit later on. Now, the second part I'd like to focus is on funding. So the way Syrian NGOs have been formed is also illustrative of the source of funding, which was predominantly and for a long time the Syrian communities outside of Syria. Individuals who've donated generously because everybody thought, at least initially, that the conflict wouldn't last very long. But of course you cannot rely on private individual donations for a long time. And so they increasingly turn towards more institutional funding from international aid agencies or donors. But accessing sufficient institutional funding is difficult. Syrian organizations are still considered unknown entities that cannot necessarily fulfill some of these requirements. And just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, one NGO told us we were asked that one of the requirements was that we have to have been in existence at least 3 or 4 years. But the conflict had only started 2 years prior, or they had to have been registered. And many of the local Syrian NGOs, they are in fact not registered for obvious reasons, not in Syria at least. Or they have to prove that they have had a number of audits. But again, that is a requirement that they cannot fulfill easily. Some of the requirements have been relaxed in the meantime, but not until valuable time was lost. And I think, again, there needs to be a dialogue with donors about some of these requirements and to what degree they need to be adhered to strictly, or whether there's a level of flexibility to, when you apply them. Coming to counterterrorism legislation. When we speak about Syria, we often and inevitably associate Syria with terrorist groups and the threat that they pose within Syria and abroad. And of course, states have recently passed a number of counter-terror legislation to combat terrorism. But they can have a potentially negative impact on humanitarian organizations, and organizations need to understand that. Some of the legal texts are quite ambiguous, and international organizations have had some experience with them in the case of Somalia, for example, or Gaza. And I think they would be well placed to assist some of the Syrian NGOs in learning to navigate through these very ambiguous and quite complex legal texts to understand what potential negative repercussions they can have. And again, what we'd like to see is a more sustained dialogue with donors on these issues, but also with legislators. International organizations grapple with many of the same challenges. And what we're saying is that while they may be affected differently, international aid agencies and Syrian organizations struggle with the same issues. We're not saying that requirements should be thrown overboard or professional standards should be ditched altogether, but there is a space where organizations, international and Syrian ones, could work better together. I think one of the how this can be achieved is by speaking together, by defining, for example, from the Syrian side, what is it in terms of capacity building that is needed? Be specific about what the requirements are, what kind of training you need. Syria has been marked by a lot of security issues, by not wanting to share necessarily information, but there are safe spaces where international organizations and Syrian organizations can exchange ideas and exchange some of the lessons learned perhaps from other conflicts. Syrians have endured 4 years of conflict, and as Michael mentioned, there's no end in sight. It's not a question of who is better, whether international organizations or Syrian organizations. Each has a role to play. The question is, how can they both use their comparative advantages in enhancing the humanitarian response and help Syrians in this conflict? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'm going to open up the discussion now amongst the panelists, and then we'll bring you all in after that. Rula, do you want to pick up from where Eva was talking about the role of the diaspora groups and perhaps reflect on your own experiences in this regard?
Sure, of course. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today, and thank you for everyone for coming. I'll talk a bit about Hand in Hand for Syria, yes, if that's okay, because that's what I know most about. Like Eva said, very much so, organically grew once humanitarian needs were obvious in the country, and it's sort of a source of pride as well as heartbreak to see where we've come from and where we are now. Pride for having developed and learned exponentially, and for providing some amazing services we're very proud of, and obviously heartbroken for the fact that we need to be here and have needed to do that. Starting from just informal groups, friends and family working together, as the need grew, we many of us coalesced and then ended up formalizing some of those NGOs. So Hand in Hand for Syria is 3 years ago, 3 years old, exactly almost this month. And it was at that point actually that I joined as a volunteer, and we've grown massively. I mean, we now have, our core staff is 10, but on our programs team we have 25, but our logistics team is some over 200 people inside Syria, and our HQ is in the UK, but our operations are run from Turkey, and we've now opened our offices in Jordan. So there's been a huge expansion in that 3 years, and I think, like you said, the huge advantage that we have is that we know the country so well. We have trusted people who we know across the country, who we know we can work with, who we know will deliver aid to who it's needed, and in the safest possible way. And that puts us at a huge comparative advantage compared to other actors.
Thanks, Rula. Muhammad, can I bring you in here and perhaps tell us a little how Syria Relief was formed and how it's working now in the country?
Well, I mean, like hand in hand, but just a little bit difference here. I mean, the trustees of Syria Relief, actually, I think all of them were born in Syria. So we have quite extended families over there. So I still have my parents, my siblings, my cousins everywhere. And the idea came about from actually picking up individuals in the UK, living in the UK for many years now, to establish Syria Relief as informal group, actually covering most of the country, covering most of Syria. So, for example, I come from the north, and I've got my colleagues coming from different areas of Syria, and that's how we started covering most of the country, including Homs, where the major problem started over there. We started as friends, as colleagues, and then we just grew up quite rapidly. We have 800 people actually working with us now, volunteers and and staff. We have like I think 45 people staff now based in the UK and Turkey, but the vast majority actually working inside Syria. We deliver all kind of humanitarian medical relief to the Syrian on the ground, little to the refugees, because like I said, we wanted to focus on the people inside Syria where the massive need is. So 90% of Syria Relief aid actually going inside Syria. 90%. 10% going to the neighboring countries, mainly Lebanon and Jordan. We cover 40% of our aid actually is medical. We have established schools with partners. We deliver schools. We have like 26 schools in total, more than 5,000 pupils. We established clean water in some areas. We are delivering as well delivering support to bakeries. We built one bakery inside Syria. So we're working hard really in order to deliver the humanitarian aid to the people inside. But still, there's a huge shortage. Syria needs hundreds of millions of dollars every month.
And how do you? One of the questions people always ask is how do you get access to some of the most areas most afflicted by the conflict and the violence.
How we
get access there? How
we get access? Well, I mean, all our volunteers in Syria actually, all the locals basically. We started. I can speak of of myself. I started with one person in Aleppo, and that person just contacted his friends and families, and that's how we grew up. It's all about of close circle of trustees, really. Right. So you trust one person to deliver the project, and that's how we grew up. And then we started actually having a systemic method of employing the staff, right, based on the qualifications, based on the experience, and based on the background in terms of trustees, in terms of trust and confidence. We can't really trust everybody to come along and start delivering aid. Okay. to the needs.
Thanks very much, Mohan. Looking at the perspective of international NGOs, Rebecca, could you say something about how Mercy Corps, which is of course a long-standing NGO, international NGO, how it's reacted to the Syrian crisis?
Sure. So Mercy Corps has been operating in Syria in response to the humanitarian crisis since 2012. Our current portfolio is just under $200 million US. We receive around, in the last 3 years, we've received around, or we've had commitments for around £46 million from the British government alone. We've reached to date 3.8 million beneficiaries across Syria, and we've done that in partnership with around 100 local organisations across Syria. We're feeding 500,000 people every month in Aleppo city. And most of our hard-to-reach beneficiaries, our very vulnerable beneficiaries, are only reached through the partnerships that we have with local organisations, and because they're designing local contextualised responses to what's happening in that area. There are many challenges. I would say that we have been successful mainly because of the partnerships that we've had on the ground. I would say that in order for us to continue with that success, we have to continue working on our approach to partnership and on how we work with local organisations to take us into the next phase of this response, because we cannot continue on handouts, on service delivery. Moving forward. This conflict's going to go on for a very long time, and we're not at recovery stage, so what's in between? And that's what we need to figure out now with our partners.
Okay. It's a question, I guess, for Rula and Moham in particular. How are you able, your respective organizations, working in a context of multiple actors, all of whom have their armed wings and forces and so on. And indeed, it needs to be said that aid workers themselves have sometimes been the targets of some of these armed groups, as they have been in other conflict situations in the past. How do you negotiate your way through all of that?
I think that's partly where the being Syrian comes in as a massive advantage. Those armed actors are much more willing to negotiate with us as Syrians, because the majority of them are Syrians themselves. And especially when they know that we are purely humanitarian, neutral, impartial, and acting according to the needs, so to just distribute aid. We're, I think, in a much more strong position to negotiate with them, and therefore often succeed where INGOs often find it very difficult to do so.
Moham, add something to that?
Because the conflict has been there now for 4 years, and we started right from the beginning, we actually gained this trust from the local councils, the local people, that they know the people working with us, actually the same people actually live among them. So we have our relationship actually mostly trusted with the local councils, and that's how we deliver our aid. We rely on them. I can't really hide the fact that these local councils have got their relationship with the armed group, different ones, but we don't have that access to them. So we talk directly to the local council, because they support us with the needs assessment, and they support us with delivery of the aid itself. Like I said earlier, our volunteers actually all locals, and this is a major advantage. So once you know the community, they can trust you.
Definitely.
This is the major advantage to the Syrian diaspora actually working inside Syria.
Right. Eva, your report is entitled International and Local / Diaspora Actors. We've heard from Rula and Moham in particular that the work that their groups are doing. Isn't there an argument that the diaspora organizations and the local organizations should actually take over the delivery of most of the relief?
I don't think it's so much a question of takeover. Again, I think it's the needs are such in Syria after 4 years that one single organization or a group of organizations, aid agencies, cannot respond to the needs. It's just impossible. It's just mind-blowing what is needed today in Syria. I think the Syrian and local organizations, or diaspora and local organizations, have clearly an advantage. They access people in need where international organizations cannot go. The question is now, how can these two groups work together where international organizations can perhaps provide some of the, or can share some of the lessons they have learned, hopefully in other contexts, and provide the necessary support to Syrian and local organizations so that aid can be provided. It's not working against each other. And I think in many ways Syria is a context which has been marked by a lot of animosity within the humanitarian sector, amongst political actors, and that has not helped in finding creative ways forward. And I think that's what it needs. It needs a dialogue and it needs creativity, because Syria is just, you know, one of those contexts where kind of ready-made recipes or procedures won't apply.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, from your point of view, how does we get the sort of harmony that we'd like to see between international aid agencies and groups like Mercy Corps and the diaspora and locally based NGOs? And how do you, what's your sense of how that's working?
I mean, the difficulty is in Syria is international humanitarian law principles and practice are just out the window, quite frankly. No one respects this at all. And so that has forced aid agencies and I would say local aid agencies as well, the international community as a whole, to be very secretive for security concerns. So we don't talk publicly about specifics, about where we work, about who we work with, about which besieged areas we may or may not be responding in, because we're worried about the security implications of that. The impact of that is accountability. Right. Where is the accountability? How do we hold each other accountable? How do we, for what we're doing, and how do we hold each other accountable to the communities we're working in? And this is something that we need to open up a dialogue internally between the INGOs and the UN system and the local community actors and the local community CBOs that we're working with.
Now, you mentioned there, Rebecca, the UN system and so on, and it's curious. I think this is actually the first time it's come up in the conversation. I wonder if I could ask the other speakers, and particularly Rula and Mulham and latterly Eva, to reflect on that. We've seen this extraordinary growth of diaspora NGOs and groups. But what is the relationship, if any, to the international system and especially the UN system?
There was few attempts in the past, probably 2 years ago, to have a united organization for the Syrian charities based in the UK to work under that umbrella. But for many reasons, actually, that didn't work out. I think simply because these charities have done their own need assessment on the ground. They have their own reach inside Syria. So there was a little bit of differentiation between these charities. So I can tell you now, these charities don't really work on the ground, for instance, Syria on the same pitch. Okay, so Hand in Hand delivers somewhere, Syria Relief delivers some other way in Syria. So we have allocated our own territories to deliver inadvertently. It just happens
because of the people you've got working
exactly,
with you.
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
own context and experience.
But we still hope, actually, all the UK charities, the Syrian based, actually, they hope to unite each other and work and coordinate the work, so they can actually deliver better and quicker.
Okay, Rula?
I understood your question as the relationship of the Syrian NGOs to the UN system and the international system.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the overarching relationship is one of trying to coordinate together, I would say, is probably the biggest relationship. So under umbrella of UN OCHA, NGO Forum, it took us a while to get there, but there is Syrian NGO representation in many of these coordination meetings. And we have been able to push on some issues of advocacy, especially for funding for Syrian groups, and the HPF funding is one of those sort of successful examples of actually being able to say, hang on, we want some direct funding as the Syrian NGOs, and actually it working. But I think that we've got a long way to go before we, as Eva say, look at each other as equal partners in this great chaos that is the Syria humanitarian crisis. there's a lot of room for that relationship to develop. But the frustration we have as the NGO groups is that there doesn't seem to be much of a sense of urgency. The system, the humanitarian aid system, has proved too inflexible and too slow-moving for the rapidly deteriorating situation. So I think that there's lots of steps that we can take, but we need to be taking them as a matter of urgency, and yesterday, so certainly today. Yeah.
Eva, you want to add something to that?
I think perhaps one of the stumbling blocks, and Rula, you mentioned it, I think the formal system, so when we speak about the formal system, we mean the UN, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, and INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, have developed systems and procedures over years that perhaps were applicable, or they were adapted to a certain context, but Syria has put that system in front of challenges that it seem kind of insurmountable. I think that shouldn't be the case. I mean, history has shown that many conflicts have been quite challenging before, but I think where the problem is that lessons are not being learned. They're being identified, but they're not being necessarily learned. And I think many of the procedures, while they're important and while they're good, there needs to be that flexibility to adapt to a context. And like Rula said, I think a lot of progress has been made, but it has come at a price. It has come slowly. Things that you would think, a coordination mechanism that would help to bring in Syrian NGOs would have been established early on, but that came only 2-3 years into the conflict. I also think one of the issues is what I mentioned before, the fear of the unknown. So Syrian NGOs, how do we know that they have procedures in place that avoid aid diversion? What is their track record? So when you have an organization that's been around for only 2 years, how do you know how good they are? And I think that fear, in many ways, has prevented perhaps that formal system and donors to engage with them, because they're kind of still waiting. Well, are they to be trusted? Are they? And I think that has perhaps slowed down that whole process, where a dialogue early on could have perhaps speed up things a little bit.
Rebecca, you come in?
Yeah, I would say on that point, from the donor community side, so when we're talking about the British government or USAID, or for example, I've seen an incredible amount of flexibility on their side and appetite for taking a few more chances and a few more risks to go in that direction of working with local organisations. I think where the mindset needs to have a little bit of work is at the INGO level and the UN system level. The UN system and the INGOs registered from Damascus face their own constraints because of the political situation. The INGOs that are doing other work in Syria and working outside of that system in Syria, I think then there's real possibility where they can explore partnership. They can explore the possibilities of working with local organisations in Syria. There is more freedom and more flexibility to do that. And I think there's a few things that, I can draw upon how Mercy Corps has tried to build their program, making sure, A, there's Arabic speakers on the team. There's no point in working with local communities if you don't speak the language. B, making sure that when you're setting up your systems to work with partners, that you're setting up a structure on the INGO side that can operationally work with partners. So, for example, you have your partner focal points under your program team at the centre, and then you have your operations, finance, security, your finance compliance, security, M&E, capacity building. These departments sit around programs and your partner focal points, and they're resources that your program managers draw upon to then implement the programs. In terms of this question, sorry to go to keep going, but in terms of this question about systems and accountability, I agree with you. I think there needs to be some more innovation on the international humanitarian community side about how we do X, Y, and Z, alternative procurement guidelines, etc. And I definitely agree that inside Syria that it's trust. These groups formed from trust. If you're working in a besieged area, it's a group of friends that got together and go, right, well, we can get $1,000 here and we can maybe buy X, Y, and Z here and we can deliver this. How do you bridge that with that? And what are the pluses and what are the strengths and challenges of each? And it's basically at the INGO level, figuring that out. I want to give a really concrete example, if I can, of an example where systems might actually have helped a local organisation. So, for example, if you're subgranting with a local organisation and you're providing a cash subgrant so they can procure something locally, the cash handling system, how you get the cash from A to B, how do you get it from the outside into Syria? You can't use the formal system because, for several reasons, security and safety reasons, because the money is going to be traced to X, Y, and Z. So you have to use informal systems. The organisation might get their money from outside, and they might take it across in backpacks. Let's just say they're taking the money across in backpacks, okay? And they work on trust. They know that this guy they can trust. They can trust him to deliver this in every month to this person in here. They trust him. And then say the international organisation steps into that, and you're like, okay, you know, we've done our partner assessment. We're going to trust this. We're going to trust this. However, say, for example, hypothetically, someone inside Syria finds out this guy's the money guy that's bringing in $30,000 every month because we're living in a conflict. It's a conflict setting. They find out that this guy is the guy that's bringing in $30,000 a month. They kidnap his brother. They tell him, you need to bring in the backpack and you need to give us the backpack when you come across, otherwise we're going to do something to your brother, cousin, X, Y, and Z. Trust works, but if you don't have a system in place that provides some protection for people, then that is not the responsible thing to do. Particularly when we're talking about larger sums of money and we're talking about if you're using a subgranting system per se, for example.
Okay. Thanks.
Can
Now, I want
can I just add one thing.
one brief comment.
One brief comment. I mean, equally, the training actually is extremely important. It's quite fundamental to develop the teams inside the country, as well as the staff in the UK, as well as the neighbouring countries. I just want to say that we are really grateful to the INGOs who actually provided our staff with sufficient and appropriate training so we can actually execute the projects, deliver the aid to the civilians over there. So it's not only about funding. I agree totally with the challenges, but training is extremely important. We're still going through a learning curve. I mean, 4 years now down the line, I'm still learning every single day.
For sure. Thank you. We're going to open it up to the audience now. And before I do so, I'm told I should say the event hashtag is hashtag Syria diaspora, capital S, capital D. And please feel, if you're so inclined, to tweet on this event. We'll also be taking some questions from people who are following this meeting online. So who'd like to start? Please identify yourself when you speak and say if your question is addressed to one of the panelists or indeed to all four of the panelists. Gentleman directly in front of me has caught my attention. Please.